to keep people just in the state that you're describing of fear and not living long as well at the end. How do you view that, Colin?
Yeah, I'm afraid this is likely to be true. But you see, when you said in our world, surely one of our main problems is, that we're living in a world that gives a lot of justification for paganism. I don't feel that, this is the point at all. Because whenever this shock of recognition occurs, you get that strange feeling. I've told again and again that story in my work about how Graham Greene, the novelist, played Russian roulette with a revolver he found in a cupboard, and how he usually was a pessimistic sort of schoolboy. When he pointed this gun at his head, spun the chambers, and then pulled the trigger, and then he heard just a click and realized he hadn't blown out his brains. He experienced an overwhelming feeling of sheer happiness and delight, a feeling that's far more powerful than any normal feeling we experience. Now, this is what we're talking about. It's actually a shock, a real shock of recognition. And so to say that we're living in a world that gives lots of justification for misery, it misses the point. Because in a sense, you could say that if you looked back 200 years even, you were living in a world with far more misery in it, far more poverty and starvation, and, children being forced to go to work at the age of 10, and so on. So, in fact, we are living in a world in which everything, in a way, is quite wonderful compared to in those days. All we have to do is simply learn to grasp this.
So it isn't as bad as we might think it is in one way, but the trick there is to stay in that mindset, I think, as well, and of being positive. And would you say that is about disconnecting from the world, maybe even connecting with the idea of the outsider overall, that you've obviously written about, that we need to live our own lives and not the lives of everybody else or whatever is happening in the world, because ultimately that doesn't concern us, so to speak?
Well, you see, when I was in my teens and I first began to think about the idea of the outsider, about the outsiders I admired particularly, like, say, Van Gogh or Beethoven or Nijinsky, I had this feeling that I had discovered one of the most important subjects in the whole world, and that if I clung on to this, then, nothing else would matter too much. I had a feeling almost of a kind of religious revelation. And of course, it just so happened that at about this time, I also stumbled upon the Bhagavad Gita, the sort of Hindu scripture, and began doing a great deal of meditation and that kind of thing. Well, I think that once you've got used to this idea of making a certain effort, a certain kind of spiritual effort, you've already made the greatest commitment you could possibly make. You see, when I wrote The Outsider, the last lines of The Outsider was that when a person begins this long path, they begin it as an outsider, but he may end it as a saint. And I've always been preoccupied with this idea. It ought to be possible to be a saint, to become a saint, simply by logic, by understanding the logic of this human existence that we lead. Most people's logic is so vague. Their reaction to problems is so immediate that they simply have to learn to use their rationality far more. So this is the reason that I've always been, in a way, a highly rational sort of person.
We can use, obviously, our our brain and our mind to that advantage, that we can go about problem solving, and maybe this is applicable to what we talked about earlier in terms of the state of the world as well, that we have to think, and as you said, Colin, compare to how things were 200 or even 500 years ago, and see that we're in a better position maybe now than we were then.
Not only that, but I think that you can actually, once you approach a problem with a certain kind of drive and optimism, the problem tends to solve itself, almost as if some invisible force is helping us.
You said earlier as well, in terms of how the robot takes over basically our subconscious mind. And I was, interesting enough, reading in an article yesterday about how thought creates reality as well, and it was talking about this aspect of how, for instance, when people drive or other things like this, we actually end up in a kind of a trance, a hypnotic state where subconscious takes over. And this article actually argued that this was a good thing in this case, because if our conscious mind would have been driving, there would be a lot more accidents on the road because people would panic and things like that.
Sure.
And so in that sense, it seems like in certain instances, this is a good thing, obviously, that we have this ability to kind of hand things over, if you will, to the subconscious
to the
mind.
robot.
Yeah.
The robot is obviously tremendously useful, but we have to learn how to get things back from the robot. Now, when you're young, this is not all that difficult, because fortunately most young people have a fairly strong sexual urge. And so, if they're interested in a person of the opposite sex, it tends to be fairly easy to suddenly experience this sense of, my God, isn't the world wonderful?
Mm.
As you get older, this gets slightly more difficult, I find. I mean, I'm now nearly 79.
Mm.
I should be 79 in a week's time.
In about a week, yeah. Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you. But what I'm hoping is that, I personally have no reason, as far as I can see, why my mind should not continue in the way that it is at the moment. In other words, fairly awake, fairly alive, subject to lots of new ideas. To be honest, the only problem with me at my age is that I find your legs get less good, and it's more difficult to go on long walks.
Yeah.
More painful.
How, if we talk a little bit about this idea, if we go back to the occult again, a big aspect of your work, and I remember watching a documentary about Aleister Crowley. That's a few years ago now, but I rewatched it recently. It's called The Other Loch Ness Monster. You might remember that. Obviously, you were in that, and this was about Crowley's time at Boleskine House in Scotland, and you were generally talking about magic and the occult, and this comment stuck with me that you mentioned that basically that the reason why people are attracted to it, or the reason why people go back to it is because it actually works. It's a potent force, and it's true in that sense. And I wonder if you maybe can talk a little bit more about that in terms of both the magic and the occult, if you make any differences between those two terms, and also what it is that why does it work, if I can put it that way? How come these things do work indeed? Well,
Crowley thought that magic was discovering your true will. In other words, that magic was something to do with what you might call the real you. Again, to go back to this notion of the robot, William Blake, the poet, once said, "Each man is in his spectre's power until the arrival of that hour when his humanity awakes and casts his spectre into the lake." And what he's saying is that once something inside you wakes up, there is an extraordinary force which we human beings are quite capable of exerting, and which will suddenly lift us to a new level. Now, this is what Crowley meant by magic. And there are quite a few stories. You probably remember the story of somebody asking Crowley to demonstrate to them the power of magic.
Mm-hmm.
So Crowley began to, they were in London, I think, to walk along the street behind a man who looked like a stockbroker who was carrying a briefcase. Crowley walked behind him and began to imitate his walk exactly and precisely. And then quite suddenly, Crowley broke his stride and collapsed.